Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Final Fantasy VII Retrospective. Just like with Final Fantasy VI, this game supports a rather depressing, muted color palette. However, unlike Final Fantasy VI, this time around the muted color palette actually works in the game's favor. Whereas Final Fantasy VI was a more traditional Western fantasy setting, Final Fantasy VII is set in a dystopian corporatocracy. That is to say, it's a system of government where a corporation is the government. This game is already meant to be depressing in its story, not to mention the game's backstory has the Shinra Corporation already halfway to destroying the planet by extracting its life force. As such, the muted colors this time around actually work in the game's favor because they help tell the story of what Shinra has done to the world. One thing about this game's graphics that does not work, however, is the way the stores are labeled in the Wall Market section of the game. There's a side quest where I'm supposed to go around obtaining clothes so I can pass as a woman. The in-game directions tell me to do things like go to the gym to get a wig, or go to the bar and convince my alcoholic father to get off the sauce for 5 goddamn minutes. The only problem with this is that the logos on the shops are still written in Japanese, meaning that actually finding these places is much more of a pain in the ass for me, an English speaker, than it was probably originally intended to be. Yes, I'm aware this game was originally made in Japan, but literally every other word in this game has been translated into English. So why weren't the logos on the shops in this section of the game also translated? Now, I know what some of you are currently thinking. Most other text in the game is found in text boxes, which are completely separate from the rest of the game world. They can be translated without affecting anything else in the game. The logos on the Wall Market shops, on the other hand, are part of the graphics themselves. This means that translating them would require new graphics altogether, and that's not something the localization team was likely prepared for. They're translators, not graphics designers. To that I say, this is a problem the game developers created for themselves. They didn't have to make the shop's logos be part of the shop's exterior models. Game director Yoshinori Kitase, who, this time around, is the only person listed in the game's credits as a director, so there's no dispute this time around as to who had final say in the matter, obviously knew this game was going to be released in North America. Sure, this series got off to a rocky start when it came to English localization, but by this point of the series, it was basically a foregone conclusion that the game was going to come out in North America. So, if Kitase didn't design this game in a way that would facilitate a smooth localization process, that's his own damn fault. Fortunately, it's the only section in the game that has this problem. One flaw with the graphics that is not limited to just one section of the game, however, is in the way the graphics often make it difficult to navigate through the game. This is the first game in the franchise to be in full 3D, not counting later remakes like Final Fantasy III on the Nintendo DS, and it has quite a few growing pains. In fact, except in a handful of areas, I believe this game isn't even truly 3D, but rather a bunch of 3D models inside a 2D game world. Take, for example, this moment right here. In order to progress in the game, I'm supposed to go across this plank in order to get on top of this plateau. The way the graphics are set up, it looks like this blank is a bridge from one plateau to the next, but it's actually on an incline. It turns out that what I'm actually supposed to do is head to the ground, then walk up this plank rather than walk across it. The graphics in this case just confuse me. This seems like a minor nitpick, but this problem persists across the entire game. Nearly every section of the game had at least a few places where I had difficulty not figuring out where to go, but figuring out what parts of the map I was and wasn't allowed to walk on. Sometimes it felt like I was navigating a maze of invisible walls rather than barriers that actually looked like barriers. This continued all the way until the final dungeon of the game. What's most annoying about this is the fact that you can't even attribute this to being the first 3D Final Fantasy game, because the art of using contrasting colors to convey traversable versus intraversable terrain has existed for as long as video games have existed. So Kitase does not get a free pass this time around simply because it's new technology. Then there's the final battle against Sephiroth. Normally, I would include talk about the battle in the section dedicated to the gameplay, but in this case I need to include it in the graphics because there's a section in this battle that is entirely non-interactive, so there's no gameplay to talk about. There is an attack in Sephiroth's arsenal whose animation just takes way too long. Specifically, I'm talking about his supernova attack. To call this battle animation excessive would be an understatement. There's really no words that can properly explain just how egregious this attack animation is, so let me just play it for you. Bear in mind that I am not slowing this footage down, nor am I editing it in any way that makes it seem longer than it actually is. The only change I will make to this footage is putting this timer on screen so you can see just how long this attack animation literally takes. Are you ready? Okay, here we go. God! That attack animation plays out several times during the final battle. You cannot skip it, and it does not change. Also, that music that was playing during the clip was called One-Winged Angel, and many people consider it to be one of the most iconic pieces of music in all of video games. I personally consider it to be okay. This transitions me to my next point. It would not be an Ace Reborn Final Fantasy Retrospective if I didn't include my obligatory section where I dump all over Nobuo Uematsu for being a shit composer. Fortunately, in this game he does not disappoint in being a disappointment. This time around, the biggest offender in the musical department is the victory fanfare music. Now, since this game is set in a dystopian corporatocracy, the victory fanfare music has been changed to a more grim and gritty tone, which is okay in principle. The problem is that he also keeps the opening riff from the old Final Fantasy victory fanfare themes. The result is a Frankenstein's monster-like creation of two completely incompatible musical tones. My neck is sore from the sheer whiplash effect of that sudden tonal shift. It feels like Welcome to the Jungle by Guns N' Roses, only in mid-verse. Literally just in mid-verse, it switches immediately and inexplicably to Yellow Submarine by the Beatles. All because Uematsu is a shit composer who doesn't know how to do transitions in tone properly. That being said, some of you might reasonably ask, is there literally any part of this game's soundtrack that I like? Well, yes, there is one song, the Cosmo Canyon theme song. It starts out pretty mediocre, but I end up tapping my foot when the clarinet starts playing. Now, that being said, even though there is a song in this game that I like, I still maintain that Uematsu is a shit composer. Why? Because that was literally the only song in the entire game that I found myself actually enjoying. But there are a total of 85 songs in the game overall. That's one decent song, and 84 songs that range from mediocre to just plain trash. The overwhelming majority of this game's soundtrack is a complete disappointment. This game starts out in a unique way for a Final Fantasy game. It starts without an overworld, instead having the first few hours of the game take place entirely inside the city of Midgar. Each section of the map only had a handful of exits that you would take to another section of Midgar. For a while I thought the whole game was going to be like this. The portions of gameplay I saw before I played this game certainly didn't show any portions of the open plains overworld, so I thought the whole game was going to take place in Midgar, and I was honestly okay with that. I had sat through 6 games that had stuck to this formula, and I was ready for a formula change. Sadly, that didn't happen. About halfway through Disc 1, we find ourselves leaving Midgar and venturing out into the Great Blue Yonder. From this point onwards, it really is the standard Final Fantasy formula, which sucks because I was actually quite excited for a shakeup to the status quo. The battle system does try something different. However, instead of using the typical job system to determine which characters can cast which spells or have which abilities, the game instead uses a magical substance called materia. This materia is equipped not on the character, but on the character's weapon and armor. Each character is limited to a specific weapon type. For example, Tifa is limited to hand-to-hand weapons like boxing gloves or brass knuckles, while Barrett is limited to machine gun type weapons, etc., etc. However, each weapon and armor we acquire has a different number of materia slots on them. By adding materia to the weapons and armor, we gain the ability to cast the corresponding spells or perform the corresponding actions. For example, the Steal materia gives that character the ability to steal items from an enemy during battle. I honestly really like this approach to rolling your class. In addition to allowing you to mix and match different traits of jobs to create fully customized classes, it also creates an extra layer of depth in deciding which items to equip at any given time. Some weapons may deal more damage but have fewer materia slots. Some weapons may have more materia slots but fewer paired slots, so it isn't just a straight upgrade. There's more than just raw damage output that needs to be taken into consideration. Speaking of paired slots, that's the next aspect of materia that I think this game handles really well. Materia are color-coded based on what they do. For example, red materia grants the equipper various summon abilities, green is your basic attack materia, yellow is utility materia, and so on and so forth. Blue materia, meanwhile, is materia that, by itself, does nothing. However, when you place a blue materia in a paired slot and place another materia in the other slot in that same pair, the blue materia will enhance the effects of the other materia. My personal favorite type of blue materia is the all materia, which I like to pair up with the lightning materia. This causes all spells of the corresponding element, in this case lightning, to become area of effect spells rather than single target. This makes the bolt spells quite useful for clearing out large swarms of nuisance enemies in one fell swoop. However, as much as I like the materia system in principle, there are a few ways in which the execution could have been handled a little better. Even if we take into account the fact that this was the first game to have a materia system, I still feel the game developers should have noticed a few quality of life improvements they could have made to the way the system is handled. For starters, there is no way to sort the materia. You can sort the items based on a large number of factors, but the materia cannot be sorted. Whenever I equip a materia, the materia that I equip in order to make room for the new materia gets put in the slot in the game's menu that the new materia had just opened up. Combine that with the fact that you cannot sort the unequipped materia alphabetically or otherwise, and it was only a matter of time before my unequipped materia menu became a disorganized, jumbled clusterfuck of a mess. In addition to that, if I have a rare materia equipped on a character and I want to equip that materia onto a different character, I have to have both characters in my party at that moment. If the previous holder of the materia is out of my active party, I have to use the PHS system to swap my party out, re-equip the materia, and then switch my party back up again. For one thing, that's a pain in the ass. But even barring that, there are a few times in the game when a character is indisposed for whatever reason. So if I want to get a rare materia off him, I have to wait patiently for the story to decide I can have him in my party again whenever the game is good and ready. Until that character is back in my party, I'm fucked when it comes to unequipping his materia, armor, or accessories. What's really infuriating about this is that these flaws could easily have been prevented with just a handful of quality of life improvements that, collectively, would have taken a single programmer less than a day to implement. Have identical copies of materia stacked with each other, with numbers on the right side telling me how many I have of each. Allow me to filter materia based on the color and sort the materia alphabetically. And allow me to get materia on and off characters regardless of who is in my party at the moment or who is even eligible to be in my party. This is hardly rocket science. Aside from the materia, the other big addition to the combat system this time around is in the character's limit breaks, which basically act as finishing moves. As the characters take damage, their limit meter goes up. When it reaches their maximum, they can unleash a devastating attack that is much more powerful than their normal attacks. Honestly, I have very few opinions on this game mechanic. It works, it does exactly what it's meant to do, and there's very few caveats attached. It honestly doesn't set the world on fire, but nor is it a complete failure either. Honestly, there is only one problem I do have with the limit break system. Once you've filled up your limit bar, you cannot do a regular attack until you've done your limit break, making it rather awkward if you're trying to save your limit break for the upcoming boss fight. It really should have been something you had the option of storing away for later use. However, in terms of gameplay, the area where this game most falls flat is in its controls. This game doesn't exactly make full use of the PS1 controller. It feels like the earlier games, which used much simpler controllers with much fewer buttons. But even barring that, the camera controls are weird. Because this is the first 3D Final Fantasy game, this is the first game to feature a 3D overworld. Whenever you're on the overworld, you can use the L1 and R1 buttons to rotate the camera. Why those buttons? Because the PS1 controller didn't automatically have dual analog sticks. Sure, some controllers had them, but it wasn't until the 6th generation of consoles that dual analog sticks became the standard. Because it wasn't a foregone conclusion that a player had dual analog sticks, the overwhelming majority of game developers chose to design their games on the assumption that the player was using one of these controllers. Ape Escape is literally the only PS1 game I have ever played, though I'm sure others exist, that actually required an analog controller. As such, other buttons would often have to be used to control the camera. But that's not what makes the camera control so weird. Considering that the game was being designed for a non-analog controller, I can understand why the shoulder buttons would have been used. No, the real problem is with the camera controls everywhere else except the overworld. First of all, when I'm in the airship, I don't use the L1 and R1 buttons to rotate the camera. Instead, the game uses the same control scheme as the airships in Final Fantasy VI, where the left and right buttons adjust the camera, the bottom face button accelerates, the right face button lands, and the up and down buttons ascend and descend without actually landing. That last part is completely pointless. There's never any point in the game where you have any reason to not be at the max altitude. But even barring that, why not just let me use the same control scheme as before? In both cases, I'm in the overworld. The only difference is that in one scenario, I'm in a vehicle, and in the other scenario, I'm on foot. Hell, even when I'm in any other kind of vehicle except the airship, the controls are still the same as if I'm on foot, so it isn't even a matter of me being in a vehicle, it's literally just the airship that has a different control scheme, and that's just dumb. Then there's the camera controls whenever I'm not in the overworld at all. Specifically, the camera controls are entirely non-existent. This was also a product of its time. See, because 3D graphics were a new technology, many game developers struggled to learn how to program for it, and one area where they struggled the most was in camera controls. Nowadays, most game developers have the art of camera control down to a science, but back in the 5th and 6th generation of consoles, it was not uncommon for the camera to face directions that made it extraordinarily difficult to see what you were doing. In some games, it was more of a nuisance to die at the hands of the camera either not auto-adjusting or auto-adjusting at the wrong moments than it was to die at the hands of the game's enemies.
You want to know what your worst enemy is in this game? This time, it's the camera itself. You can never situate the camera at the right angle to see what the hell you're doing. It just points wherever it wants.
and this game has worse camera control than Michael Bay. Every maneuver is made doubly difficult thanks to that infernal camera. Oh, get over!
To deal with this problem, game developers used to employ various tricks, and the exact solutions to these problems would vary from game to game. Some games, like Spyro the Dragon, opted to have the camera almost always be directly behind the character's back. Splinter Cell had a camera that never auto-adjusted for anything, but instead was entirely manually controlled by the player. So if the camera didn't face the direction you needed it to, that was the player's fault, not the game's. Meanwhile, this game opts for a CCTV approach. The early Resident Evil games are perhaps the most famous examples of this kind of camera placement. The CCTV camera system basically has the camera be in a fixed location, usually placed in a spot where a closed-circuit security camera would usually be placed if these locations were real places, hence the name. Rather than the camera following the player character, the player would instead move out of the camera's field of view, and then the game would switch to another camera, like a security guard flipping from one feed to the next in real time as he tries to follow the movements of this suspicious-looking guy. Now, in the early Resident Evil games, the most famous use of the CCTV camera system in 5th and 6th generation console games, it made sense that they used this camera system, because it was the only camera system used by those games. They probably opted for such a system because they didn't have enough confidence in themselves to have a camera system that the player could adjust at will, since that was very difficult to do back then. But in Final Fantasy VII, we clearly have a camera system the player can adjust using buttons. The L1 and R1 buttons are not used for any other purpose in this game, so this game could very easily have just given us a rotatable camera in these cities and dungeons, since the game developers have clearly proven themselves capable of making it work. However, the place where this game's controls fall the most on their face isn't in the camera system. It feels archaic, but at least it works. No, the worst part about this game's controls is just getting my character to interact with the game world. Take, for example, this section in the Wall Market. I'm trying to climb to the roof of the city so I can infiltrate Shinra headquarters. I walk up to this breaker box and Cloud determines that it needs a battery. I check an online guide and find that I'm supposed to go to this guy and buy the batteries I need. I go there, buy the batteries, return to this place, and nothing happens. I walk up to the breaker box and press the X button, and nothing happens. For a while, I wondered if I was supposed to get the batteries before I came up here and examined the breaker box. And now that I did those two things in the wrong order, I must have screwed myself over and soft-locked the game. But no, I just needed to position Cloud in just the right spot. This one magic pixel of a spot, and I just happened to get it right the first time, which is why I didn't catch it the first time. That was pretty early in the game, but the game had several other instances just like it. Even as late as the final dungeon of the game, I found myself constantly running into invisible walls, often resorting to online guides to tell me, no, I didn't run into a dead end, I was indeed going the right direction, I just needed to wiggle myself into exactly the right spot in order to actually advance through the dungeon. Honestly, just a single extra day of polishing the game's controls would have gone a long way to making this game a much smoother experience. Alas, it was an awkward time for 3D games, and the new technology had quite a few kinks that needed to be worked out. Speaking of new technology, the fact that the PS1 utilized a CD-ROM game media rather than cartridges means that games could now hold quite a lot more data. Even still, this game was actually released on 3 separate discs, so this game had 3 times as much data space to work with as most other PS1 games. So, with all this disk space to play around with, You can probably imagine my irritation in regards to how much this game reuses graphical assets to hell and back. Hell, they don't even reuse the same graphical assets in different parts of the game. They literally just copy and paste the same graphical assets over and over again and do so back to back. Take, for example, this outdoor dungeon. I'm in the mountains and there's a lot of snow and ice. It's basically a labyrinth. There are multiple directions I can go, and I have to figure out the right path. However, in between each main section of this labyrinth is a corridor section. It's outdoors, but I still call it a corridor because it's just a straight line with nothing interesting in it. So we literally just either go left to right or right to left until we reach the end. The problem is that Cait wasn't content just giving us one corridor in between each main section of the labyrinth. Oh no, we have to go down 3 corridor segments back to back. And I use the word different in the loosest sense possible here because there's really nothing different about these 3 corridors. They all look exactly the same. We literally just went through the corridor, and so Cait decides to give us another corridor just like it. And then a 3rd corridor just like the last 2, before we can finally move on to the next section of the dungeon. Of course, he couldn't just design 3 different looking corridors in order to give us something interesting to look at while we move from point A to point B. Oh no. There are only 2 corridor sections in this entire dungeon, but those 2 corridor sections are copied and pasted ad nauseum. Later in the game, we find ourselves in the sewers of Midgar on a mission to infiltrate the Shinra headquarters. This section of the game consists of literally nothing more than us going up and down the exact same 2 bland, dull, monochrome, boring as fudge interior cells. Once again, instead of giving us unique locations, Cait just decides to copy and paste the exact same 2 cells one after the other with no branching paths, no interesting visuals, and literally nothing to do except go up and down these 2 corridors. Oh wait, there are different numbers on the walls this time around. Okay, I take it all back, this is totally a new location.
Not entirely. Look at the word test there on the wall, that's brand new.
But the worst section of this game in terms of repeating the same graphical assets over and over again has to come in the Shinra headquarters. The first time I went through the Shinra headquarters, I went through the front door. Meanwhile, an online guide tells me that the staircase has some materia this time around that I can collect. So I decided to use the stairs this time just for a change of pace. This ended up being a huge mistake. This is the most egregious case in the entire game of reusing the same graphical assets back to back. This staircase repeats itself a total of 12 times. This amounts to literally 4 whole minutes of nothing but me going up staircase after staircase. It just goes on and on and on. Have fucking mercy. Bear in mind that at this late in the game I had already reached the max level, so I used a game shark code to turn off random encounters. This means that I literally just spent 4 minutes doing nothing but going up about 60 flights of staircases with no interesting visuals in the background and absolutely nothing happening. No, Cait, this is not acceptable. Give us some fucking variety for Christ's sake. Actually, in terms of giving us variety in gameplay, that's one of the things this game truly excels at. For the first time in the series, we have gameplay that is more than just talking to townsfolk and getting into random fights. Final Fantasy VI had some interesting puzzles in the last 2 dungeons of the game, but they never really dove feet first into the idea of having dungeons with puzzles in them. But Final Fantasy VII finally gives us some side quests and minigames to embark on. I did not do every side quest or minigame the game had to offer, but I did quite a few of them, and I'd like to discuss each divergence one at a time. That takes me to... One of the earliest minigames I encountered was in the second dungeon of the game, when I was trying to open a door. The door required 3 buttons to open, but all 3 buttons had to be pressed at the same time. So I had to time my button presses so that Cloud's hand came down on the button at the same time as the other 2. I honestly found this minigame to be pretty annoying due to the fact that the characters do this highly exaggerated movement where they move their arms up over their heads before they actually press the button in the dungeon. This meant that there was a delay of a couple of seconds from when I pressed the button on the controller and when Cloud pressed the button in-game. This was a rather pointless minigame since I get unlimited tries to get it right, I suffer no penalty for getting it wrong, and there is no time limit. So it honestly just feels like drudge work, mere trial and error until I get the timing correct. When I get to the wall market, however, that's when the side activities get a little bit more interesting. Tifa has apparently gone undercover to investigate the town pervert, Don Corneo. So to rescue her, Cloud has to dress up like a woman so the guards will let him in. As I mentioned earlier in this video, the fact that the business's exteriors are still written in Japanese makes this section of the game annoying to navigate, but putting that aside, this is certainly a fun and interesting side quest. I didn't know this at the time I played this game for footage, but there's actually an internal counter that measures how beautiful I look. All I need to advance the story is a dress and a wig, but I can improve my score by obtaining other accessories like a tiara and an amulet. Of course, the only thing that this score affects is whether Don Corneo chooses either me or Tifa to sleep with. And if he chooses Tifa, that just means I need to beat up some other goons before fighting my way into Don's bedroom. So it's only a minor setback if I don't get chosen. At one point, I'm actually challenged to a squatting contest by the guys at the local gym. I honestly could not get the timing down on these button presses. Apparently, I don't just press square and X in rapid succession. Rather, there's apparently a timing to this game, and I completely botched it. But what's really surprising is that I still got the wig anyway. I assume that if I had won the squatting contest, I would have gotten a more attractive wig that would have boosted my beauty score, but since, as I established, that's only a minor setback anyway, I'm not going to lose any sleep over it. On our way back to Avalanche headquarters, Avalanche being the name of the resistance movement against Shinra and the protagonists of this game, there was an interesting section of the map where I had to solve a puzzle involving moving the dusty trains around in such a way that a makeshift bridge forms, allowing me to climb over the pile of rubble. This is certainly an interesting puzzle, and I really wish the game had more puzzles like it, where I push blocks into various positions to make stuff happen, kind of like a Zelda game. Alas, this is the only section in the game with a block-pushing puzzle in it. Later, we infiltrate the Shinra headquarters. On the 65th floor, I come across one of the most boring and tedious puzzles I've ever had to do. Basically, there's a model of Midgar in the center of the floor, but it's missing some pieces. The pieces are scattered around the floor in boxes, so you have to find them and put the pieces back into the city model. This sounds simple enough, except there's one problem. The boxes containing the pieces are all locked, except for one. Which one? Well, you have to go to each box one at a time and find the box that will actually let you open it. It's pure trial and error. Then, when you actually get the piece, you have no way of knowing what the piece actually looks like, and therefore have no way of knowing which spot in the Midgar model you're supposed to put it. So you instead just have to go around the city model, pressing the X button at various spots at the model. Once again, it's nothing but trial and error. And when you do find the spot this piece is supposed to go on, another box unlocks, forcing you to go around the floor again, trying each box one at a time again, in search of that one box that will actually give you a piece of the puzzle. This entire puzzle is nothing but trial and error. Then more trial and error, rinse and repeat. This puzzle really should have let me see what shape the pieces were so I could put them in the part of the Midgar City model that had the corresponding shape taken out of it, like a jigsaw puzzle. It wouldn't have made the puzzle fun or interesting. If anything, it would have simply turned the puzzle from one of trial and error to one of putting the square block in the square hole and the star-shaped block in the star-shaped hole, but it would have at least made the tedium go by just a little bit faster. But then we actually escape the Shinra headquarters, and all sins from the previous puzzle are instantly forgiven when we have an epic car chase minigame. Now this minigame is fucking awesome. Cloud is on a motorbike while the other main characters are in a car. Shinra forces are in hot pursuit. As Cloud, you must zigzag back and forth using the square and circle buttons to swing your sword to the left or right, taking out Shinra enemies before they can do too much damage to your friend's vehicle. Hot damn, this car chase minigame really hits the nail on the hammer. I honestly wouldn't have minded this as its own standalone indie game on Steam. After we leave Midgar, we eventually come across a fort named Fort Condor. The story with these guys is that some giant Chocobo has set up her nest on top of this Mako reactor, and Shinra doesn't seem to like that. So they're set on killing the Chocobo to get it off the reactor. The people at the fort are a bunch of tree-hugging hippies, so they're going to protect this Chocobo and her eggs with their lives. The result is a relatively interesting real-time strategy minigame where I use the money I've earned from elsewhere in the game to buy units, place them on the map, and have those units go up against enemy units until one side is completely defeated. Since I used a Game Shark code to give me infinite money, this was quite easy to do. It's an interesting side quest, but with one fatal flaw: sheer overkill. If you want to get every reward this place has to offer, you practically have to return here nearly every time you advance the main quest even slightly. For example, after our first trip here, we head over to the city of Junon, save a girl from drowning, deliver CPR on her, and she invites you to come look at something that will help you in your quest. After you've given her CPR, but before you go to see what she wants to show you, you're supposed to head back to Fort Condor and have another battle. If you don't go at that exact moment, you forever lose the reward for that battle. In order to 100% the game, you actually have to return to Fort Condor a total of 21 times. Dear God. I don't know if I'd be able to sit through the car chase minigame 21 times in a single playthrough, and that minigame was fucking awesome. Speaking of performing CPR on a girl, that's another minigame that I consider to be just as much of a time waster as the 3-button puzzle at the start of the game. This girl needs 41 breaths breathed into her, but you can give her up to 9 breaths at a time just by taking deep breaths before you give her the CPR. However, you are always guaranteed to give her at least 1 breath each time you give her mouth-to-mouth. There is no time limit to complete this minigame, and no penalty for doing it wrong. It's literally just there for the sake of breaking up the monotony, except it doesn't even do that because it's literally just drudge work. All it does is divert the game from one form of monotony to another form of monotony. Later on down the line, we come across an amusement park called the Gold Saucer. Now, full disclosure, I did not play every game at this park during my playthrough, so I cannot comment on every one. After all, I was recording this playthrough for footage, so I need to record at a reasonably brisk pace. That said, I didn't read online that I can replay the car chase minigame at this amusement park, and reading that put a smile on my face. Though I didn't play it at the amusement park because I had already had enough footage of that minigame to go around. One game that I did play, however, was the basketball minigame, and that same online guide told me that this was the easiest way to farm GP, this amusement park's currency. I must admit, it was annoying and tedious. Granted, I am not a basketball fan, so that may be playing a role in my non-enjoyment of this game, but this minigame isn't really about shooting hoops so much as it is about timing your button presses. Basically, I'm supposed to hold down the circle button to take aim and release the circle button to actually throw the ball. However, this game requires very precise timing to get right, and I honestly cannot be bothered to practice enough to get really good at it. Thank God for save states, because otherwise I probably would have given up a lot sooner on this mini-game. There is, however, one minigame in the Gold Saucer that is mandatory, and that is at least one round of Chocobo racing. This is basically your standard racing minigame. The only thing that really sets it apart from bog standard racing is that you sometimes have to let up on the accelerate button, otherwise your Chocobo may get gassed and peter out. Car chase minigame, this is not. After Gold Saucer, we return to Nibelheim and specifically return to Shinra HQ, where we find ourselves looking for clues about a safe combination. When we find all the clues, we then go to open the safe, and this safe cracking minigame does not feel at all like a safe cracking minigame. Splinter Cell Double Agent had an actual safe cracking minigame. Now, to be fair, I understand that the game developers were not in an ideal situation. As I said before, the PlayStation 1 controllers did not have dual analog sticks as standard. As such, simulating the feeling of slowly turning the knob on a safe simply isn't a viable option. However, I see no reason why you couldn't have had the visuals mimic those of an actual safe knob. Later on, we enter the Temple of the Ancients to try and retrieve the Black Materia. There's a puzzle near the end where some purple rabbit guy is going into and out of caves. My main gripe with this puzzle is that it doesn't fully explain to the player what you're supposed to do. It says to memorize the caves, and then it says to catch this dude. Based on these instructions, I thought I was supposed to chase after this guy, but instead what I'm actually supposed to do is predict which cave he's going to come out of, and enter that cave, intercepting him rather than simply catching up to him. A little more clarity would have saved me quite a bit of running around like a chicken with my head cut off. Later, we head off to Bone Village, and this has to be the most aggravating minigame in the entire game. The goal is to dig for buried treasure, but you aren't just given a shovel, have you stand in the spot of your choosing, press the square button, and then Cloud just digs a hole and pulls out whatever is beneath the surface. Oh no, Kitase just had to overcomplicate things to a ridiculous degree. Instead, what you actually do is walk to one spot, place a marker, walk over to another spot, place another marker. Then, the game will draw a straight line between those 2 points, and in the midpoint of that line, that's where the residents of Bone Village start digging. Then, the screen fades to black, you wake up the next morning, I assume, and then you check the box. If the midpoint actually had some treasure underneath it, then the box will have that treasure inside it for you to take, otherwise the box will remain empty. Dear God, was Kitase giggling like a horny schoolgirl when he signed off on this minigame? For fuck's sake, what the hell is wrong with just having it so that I press a damn button and Cloud just digs wherever he's standing? Now, add that to the fact that you have to acquire at least one buried treasure in order to advance the game, meaning this minigame is mandatory, and I have to wonder, how the fuck is anyone supposed to do this without an online guide, or at the very least a strategy guide magazine? We then move on to a snowboarding minigame that comes immediately before the snowy labyrinth dungeon I complained about earlier. Frankly, after the minigames hit rock bottom with that treasure digging minigame, there was nowhere to go but up. So in that sense, this minigame is technically an improvement over the last minigame. But there's just one problem. If you are also watching the visuals on screen right now, you've probably noticed it. I suck at this minigame. Maybe I would have enjoyed this minigame as much as I enjoyed the car chase minigame, if only I could actually play this minigame competently. After all, this definitely seems to be as action-packed as the car chase minigame. It certainly seems to require a certain amount of reflexes, and it's set to similarly fast-paced music. Alas, because I suck at it, I didn't enjoy it all that much. During our quest to obtain the huge materia, there's a train minigame where I'm trying to drive a train fast enough to catch up to another train. The input for this minigame is pretty simple, but compared to the puzzle where I press the 3 buttons at the same time, or the time I deliver CPR to this girl, this time around I actually have a time limit, which adds a much needed sense of urgency to this minigame. And last but not least, there's a submarine combat minigame that I honestly do not care for. The enemy submarine goes out of your detection range after only a few seconds, and when it leaves my detection range, I for the life of me cannot seem to find it again. Even when I move forward into the shadows that I clearly just saw the enemy sub go into, the enemy sub is still nowhere to be found. It's almost like moving out of my detection range causes the enemy sub to be completely removed from the map. The only way I was able to get past this minigame was to just go balls to the wall and spam the fire button to hell and back, killing the enemy sub within seconds before he even has the chance to get out of detection range. This means that the minigame is either completely impossible or over so quick that I don't even have time to enjoy it. Overall, the side quests and minigames in this game are hit or miss. The car chase minigame is the only one I would truly consider to be totally awesome. The rest range from moderately enjoyable to completely pointless padding, or annoying to, oh my god, I swear Katase made this frustrating on purpose just to fuck with us. However, I have been complaining this entire series about the lack of side activities, so it is nice to see that this game, literally the 7th game in the entire fucking franchise, finally got it right and gave us a wide variety of things to do. It's embarrassing that it took them 7 fucking games to finally get it right, but better late than never. Hey, if you made it this far into this video, you obviously must be enjoying the video, so why not show how much you enjoy my content by supporting me on Patreon, or by becoming a channel member for as little as $1 a month. Donate at least $5 a month and I will accept requests for video topics from you. Donate at least $20 a month and you have the right to directly assign me topics and be guaranteed to have your suggestions covered, subject to reasonable terms, of course. Click the join button below this video to become a channel member, or go to patreon.com/acerthorn to support the channel there. But even if you can't afford to donate even so much as $1 a month, there are still a few ways you can support the channel for free, which I describe in my 20-minute video, How You Can Support the Channel Without Donating. Check out that video for ideas on how you can help the channel grow without spending money. Either way, I hope you decide to support the channel in more ways than just watching this one video. Alright, recommencing the video you all came to see in 3, 2, 1. First, let's get the characters out of the way that have no character arcs, since those would take the least amount of time to talk about. For the first time in the series, nearly every character gets some decent character development, although whether they undergo a character arc is a different story, and whether that character arc is any good is an even more different story. As far as the main characters go, Tifa is the closest this game has to a blank slate. Her personality begins and ends with how she feels about Cloud. As kids, she's asking Cloud to rescue her if she ever needs rescuing, and this flashback is loaded with sexual tension. When Cloud is missing in action, she can't think about anything else except if Cloud is okay. When they find Cloud hospitalized, she leaves the group temporarily and refuses to leave Cloud's side. Right before Disc 3, she and Cloud share a tender moment of cuddling, and you can tell she just wants Cloud to shut up and kiss her. Tifa, do you like anything else? Do you have any thoughts in your skull besides Cloud and his dick? As far as having no personality is concerned, Tifa is just barely above Bella from Twilight in terms of how much her entire personality and existence is defined by her obsession with her love interest. I say that she's above Bella because at least Tifa is a strong, independent woman who can take care of herself. It's just that whenever she's not in combat, she really has no personality except having her head in, well, the cloud. Aeris is Cloud's other love interest, and the other character who doesn't have a character arc to speak of. However, unlike Tifa, she at least has a personality. She's playful, energetic, flirtatious, cheerful, and extremely reckless. That last one is the closest she comes to having a genuine character flaw. She is constantly in danger, and has gotten so used to it by the time the story starts following her that she treats the Turks' attempts to kidnap her with blasé acceptance. To her, getting kidnapped is just Tuesday, which often causes her to engage in terribly reckless behavior, like, oh, I don't know, heading over to the Forgotten City all by herself, knowing full well that if she dies, the whole world is fucked.
Do you even realize what your life means? Huh? Running off like that, putting yourself at risk, it's pretty goddamn stupid.
Aeris is also most famous for dying. The scene where she dies is one of the most iconic cutscenes in video game history. Now, for the 1% of you who didn't click away from this video after I opened the video with this cutscene set to thematically inappropriate music and sound effects that completely take the mickey out of this iconic moment, you're probably wondering what I think of this moment for realsies. Quite honestly, I find it rather disappointing. Yes, it's an iconic moment, but then again, so is T-800's line, "I'll be back," and yet if you actually go and watch the movie, you'd realize this line comes in a very insignificant, almost throwaway moment in the movie. When I saw the movie for the first time, my jaw was on the floor. This is the iconic line that everyone remembers Arnold for? Seriously, this line has no significance to anything that's happening in the main plot. I honestly see Aeris' death in much the same way. Was it sad? Sure. It was sad because of how cheerful and full of life she was. But frankly, was it really necessary to establish Sephiroth as the big bad of this game? In the game of cat and mouse leading up to this moment, we followed a trail of bodies and blood that Sephiroth had left in his wake. Honestly, I'd say those moments do more to establish Sephiroth as an indiscriminate killing psychopath than killing one completely unarmed woman who isn't even fighting back. If this game really wanted Sephiroth's actions to be seen as genuinely beyond the pale, he should have taken control of Cloud and forced Cloud to kill Aeris instead. It was established earlier in this game that Sephiroth can mind-control Cloud, and as Cloud approaches Aeris in the Sanctuary, it almost looks like that's what he's about to do until his other companions talk some sense into him. If the game had gone through with it, this would have been about 10 times as chilling as Sephiroth just swooping in and impaling Aeris like she was made of butter. However, I will defend this moment on at least one level. Narratively speaking, what this moment accomplishes is that it makes it personal for Cloud. Up until this point, Cloud and the rest of Avalanche have been looking to defeat Sephiroth just to stop him from destroying the planet. But now it's personal. Sephiroth took something from Cloud which he deeply cared about. And now Cloud has his own reasons to want to kill Sephiroth, in addition to simply stopping the destruction of the planet. So at least on that extremely limited level, I will give this scene the thumbs up. So that does it for the characters who don't have character arcs. Next up, we have Barrett, the leader of Avalanche. He's a freedom fighter who sees the Shinra Corporation as a blight on the land. He realizes that Shinra's use of Mako energy is destroying the planet by stripping the planet of its life force, known as the Life Stream, and he is determined to shut down Shinra and its use of Mako energy by any means necessary. He has a deep personal grudge against Shinra because in his hometown of North Corel, he encouraged his fellow townsfolk to give up coal mining and accept Shinra's offer to set up a Mako reactor in the hopes that this new job would elevate their standards of living. But then, as soon as the deal was finalized, rather than improve their standard of living, Shinra just leveled the town and left everyone to die. This betrayal is one of the things that motivates Barrett to destroy Shinra. One of his best friends, who died in Shinra's destruction of the town, left behind an orphaned daughter named Marlee, so he has dedicated his life to raising her as if she were his own. So we can also add loves his family onto his list of good qualities. His primary character flaw is that when it comes to his war on Shinra, he's one of those by any means necessary kind of blokes. When we blow up the first Mako reactor at the beginning of the game, hundreds, if not thousands, of people in the vicinity lost their lives. The NPCs in the game lament the tragic loss of life, wishing the victims could have at least gone in their sleep to minimize suffering. However, while this certainly makes him a flawed character, the story really dropped the ball in how it turned that character flaw into a character arc. Unlike Tifa and Aeris, Barrett has a character arc to speak of, it's just that the execution is crappy. The first problem with this character arc's execution is that there's hardly any time spent on it. We blow up the first Mako reactor early in Disc 1. Some random people comment on the needless loss of life, and then the trait of Barrett's just disappears for a majority of the game. Once the immediate shock of the collateral damage wears off, the game just treats Barrett as the foul-mouthed muscle of the group for about 18 hours. Then, much later in the game, near the end of Disc 2, Cait Sith, more on him in a minute, just randomly and out of the blue decides to confront Barrett about his callous disregard for people's lives. I actually took a timestamp using the footage I had recorded. When I was playing this game for footage, from the moment the people in Midgar were appalled by Avalanche's disregard for civilian casualties, to the moment where Cait Sith confronts Barrett about it, spanned a total of 18 hours and 37 minutes. But even barring that, Cait Sith brings it up at the most random of times, when the good guys have 1,000 more important things to worry about. It honestly feels less like a natural step in Barrett's character progression, and more like the game developers just reminding us that this character arc is still a thing, and ensuring us that they haven't forgotten about it. Especially since that happens just one dungeon raid before Barrett's character arc is quote-unquote resolved. Cait Sith confronts Barrett about his callousness, Barrett defends his callousness as being a necessary evil, then we go and stop Hojo from feeding Sephiroth, then, back on the Highwind, Barrett suddenly decides that he was actually wrong and that his agenda of defeating Shinra wasn't worth the innocent lives lost after all. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is the second major flaw with how Barrett's character arc is handled. The fact that the resolution of his character arc just comes from nowhere. We never see Barrett actually go on a journey. We never see him actually be forced to confront the damage his actions cause. We honestly spend more time seeing him have to confront the consequences of his being fooled by Shinra in the past, which wasn't even really his fault, than we spend seeing him have to own up to the loss of life he directly causes. And the saddest part about all of this is that the game had all the tools for a perfectly valid character arc right at their fingertips. Think about it. Aside from his hatred for Shinra, his other defining character trait is his paternal duty to Marlene. He is overcome with rage when he believes Marlene has been killed. He is overcome with relief to a comical degree when he sees that Marlene is okay. Immediately after he blows up the first Mako reactor, the moment when he picks up Marlene and starts carrying her around piggyback is perhaps the only time in the entire game when he seems genuinely happy and content with life. So why not weave his sense of paternal duty to Marlene into his character arc? After the aforementioned tearful reunion, Marlene and Aeris' mom are advised to go into hiding. After that scene, none of the main characters know where the two are. So, imagine if, sometime in Disc 2, Barrett decides to blow up another Mako reactor, once again not caring about who gets caught in the blast radius. But then, because he doesn't know where Marlene is hiding, he doesn't realize until it's too late that Marlene was actually next to the Mako reactor, meaning she was caught in the explosion and died from it. This time around, he can't even blame Shinra for her death, like he did when they destroyed the original Avalanche headquarters, because it wasn't even Shinra who did it. This time it was all on him, and his callous disregard for who got hurt ended up costing him that which he held most dear. It's easy to justify the casualties as being for the greater good when they're faceless, nameless heads in crowns who you've never said a single word to. But now it's cost him his adoptive daughter, and that forces him to realize that his by any means necessary mentality ultimately causes more harm than good. Now, wouldn't that have been a much more compelling character arc than just having him go, "I was justified, damn it, doodly doodly, no wait, I take it back, I wasn't justified after all"? I certainly think so. Alas, that's not what we got. Instead, Barrett's character arc happens almost exclusively off-screen, and that's just lame. Next up, we have Red 13, a cat who can talk. His introduction is a little baffling. When we first meet him, the other main characters are astonished to find that this cat-like creature can talk. When asked what he is exactly, he doesn't give a straight answer, but instead just says, "I am what you see." When asked what his name is, he says that his Shinra designation is Red 13, but that's just a meaningless serial number, so we can call him whatever we want, although his default name is Red 13. I chose to shorten his name to simply Red during my playthrough. Anyway, all of these things happening in this introduction suggest that, rather than being kidnapped like Aeris for the purpose of experimentation, he instead was literally manufactured inside Shinra and has no life outside of the Shinra laboratories. But no, he actually has a home, a family, and a life before we met him. His home is in the town of Cosmo Canyon, the place that has the only piece of music in this entire game that I actually like. When we reach Cosmo Canyon, we also find out that his real name is Nanaki, and there's an entire race of talking cat creatures that he comes from. So this begs the question, if he knows his real name, why did he just give us his Shinra designation? Why didn't he just give us his real name? For that matter, if there's an entire race of these creatures and that race is just as naturally occurring as the Chocobo, why did the good guys act with shock at the idea that a giant red cheetah can talk? And why didn't Red 13 just tell them what his species was called when they asked him what he was? Well, anyway, as far as character development is concerned, he is basically the inverse of Barrett. Red 13's character arc is just as poorly executed as Barrett's character arc, but for all the opposite reasons. Red 13's primary character flaw is that he has daddy issues. He resents his father for abandoning him and his mother in some war from before the events of the game. His mother died in battle and his father just took his paycheck and bailed, leaving his wife and son to die. Or at least that's what he believes. However, Bugenhagen, his presumably adoptive grandfather, takes him through a dungeon and shows him that his father, named Cito, didn't actually bail on them during that war, but actually petrified himself to create a barrier to ensure the enemy couldn't attack Cosmo Canyon again. Now, understanding the truth about his father's sudden disappearance, Red 13 is suddenly over his daddy issues, and is singing his father's praises, vowing to follow in his father's footsteps. While Cito may be petrified, he apparently can still see and hear everything around him, so hearing his son's proclamations of affection for him brings him to tears. Now, that description of Red 13's character arc probably makes it sound like it's executed a lot better than it actually is. Like I said a moment ago, this character arc is just as poorly executed as Barrett's arc, but for all the opposite reasons. Barrett's character flaw felt natural and organic. It felt like the natural result of his feelings of betrayal that he suffered during his backstory. But the resolution of that character arc came completely out of nowhere and happened almost entirely off-screen. Red 13, on the other hand, has the opposite problem. The resolution of his character arc feels organic and well plotted, but the fact that there was even a character arc to begin with feels contrived as hell. His character flaw comes from him believing, incorrectly, that his father bailed on him and his mom to save his own skin. As soon as it's explained to him that his father actually did the complete opposite, he completely changes his tune. So this begs the question of why Bugenhagen didn't simply show Red 13 this statue ages ago. His entire character arc is caused just by a lack of communication, and I can't think of a single reason why Bugenhagen wouldn't have cleared up that communication error long before Red 13 got introduced into the actual game. Then there's the problem of this character arc's pacing. Like Barrett, Red 13's character arc suffers from terrible pacing, but for the opposite reason as Barrett. With Barrett, the game spent more than 18 hours before it was finally ready to dust off Barrett's character flaw and actually do something with it. But with Red 13, his character flaw doesn't get introduced until several hours after the character gets introduced. But once the flaw finally gets thrown out there, the character arc then moves at a completely breakneck pace. My daddy was a coward who bailed on us. No, he didn't bail on you. I love my daddy! To call this character arc rushed would be an understatement. Next, there is Cid. Cid is a recurring character in the Final Fantasy games, although technically not the same character each time. Since the Final Fantasy games are an anthology, he still tends to perform much the same function in each game he appears in, that of the tech genius. The only Final Fantasy game he hasn't appeared in is the first game, and even then, later remakes of that game tend to get credit an off-screen character named Cid with having invented the airship. Anyway, in this incarnation of the character, he's a disgruntled failed astronaut. His life's dream was to go into outer space, but that dream is sabotaged by, well, he says she's not his wife, but she lives with him and tends to his house, so I guess the lady he lives with. Hey Cid, you can get millions of YouTube video views by introducing her to video games for the first time. Anyway, this woman he lives with, named Shira, sabotages his space mission because she's taking too long to inspect the fuel tanks for malfunctions. They're almost ready to blast off, but she won't get out of the engine room despite numerous warnings that she'll be roasted to a crisp. Cid is forced to abort the takeoff at the last minute, postponing his dream of going into space for at least another 6 months. However, in that 6-month time period, Shinra discovers that Mako energy is much more profitable and so shelves the space program, putting an end to Cid's dreams of going into space indefinitely and stirring quite a bit of resentment and anger towards She-Ra. However, later in the game, when there's a giant meteor about to smash into Earth, Shinra reopens the space program in the hopes of sending an ICBM into the meteor, blowing it up. This means that Cid finally has his chance to, albeit briefly, go into outer space. Because the space shuttle wasn't originally meant to be an ICBM, it came equipped with an emergency escape pod, which the protagonists are able to use to escape back to Earth. Now that Cid has finally experienced his dream of going into outer space, he's suddenly more willing to forgive She-Ra. However, there's actually a twist in the tale. It turns out that She-Ra was right all along. Fuel tank number 8 was indeed faulty, and as the heroes are evacuating to the escape pod, that fuel tank explodes and traps Cid underneath. The other 2 player characters can't lift the tank off of him. It's only thanks to She-Ra providing a 3rd set of hands that they're able to get it off him. So not only did She-Ra save Cid in that moment, but Cid suddenly realizes that she was right the first time as well, so he apologizes for being such a potty-mouthed dickhead to her all these years. Except, even all the way back then, She-Ra was still in the wrong. Think about it, they were about to blast off and she was given numerous warnings to get out of the engine room. These were warnings that she chose to ignore. She was an adult, so she can do whatever she wanted. That was a valid choice and hers to make. But as an adult, she also bore 100% of the responsibility for her own choices. So if she was killed by her refusal to heed these warnings, her blood was on her own hands. But I know what you're all thinking. If she had left the engine room, the fuel tank would have just blown up anyway, so they would have still been screwed. Well, no, they wouldn't. Remember, they had the escape pod. If the original blast-off had gone off as planned, and then the fuel tank had exploded just like it did when they were on board, the astronauts could have just went into the escape pod and aborted the mission that way. Except in that case, there would have been absolutely no way Cid could possibly have blamed She-Ra for anything, so he wouldn't have spent the past few decades treating her like shit. So overall, Cid's character arc makes sense. Unlike the previous 2, there's no real serious flaws with how it's executed. It's just that Cid forgave She-Ra for something that ultimately was her fault after all. Next up, we have Cait Sith, and this is a character that really baffles me. His character arc is not very explicit. I think we're supposed to just infer that it happens. It isn't explicitly shown to us. We meet him in the Gold Saucer, where he poses as a fortune teller. He predicts that we, Aeris and Cloud, will succeed in our goal, but it will cost us something we value greatly. I wonder if this great cost is meant to foreshadow Aeris' death. However, that would suggest that Cait Sith really does have fortune-telling powers, but the fortunes he gives are the kind of cryptic nonsense that real-life fortune-tellers often give, due to them being applicable to nearly any situation because of how cryptic they are. If Cait Sith really was predicting Aeris' death, I wonder why he didn't just tell us outright what our future holds. Then he decides he's going to join our party. He even explicitly states that he's joining us whether we want him to or not. That alone should be a huge red flag that this guy is plotting something, and it isn't long before we learn just what that something is. We go through a gauntlet of enemies over at Gold Saucer, which I didn't cover in the section about side quests and minigames because it's literally just combat, so it's not anything really new to the Final Fantasy franchise, and we get the keystone for our troubles. However, just as we're getting ready to leave, the exit train gets shut down, so we have to spend the night at the haunted house-themed inn. During the night, Cait Sith interrupts Aeris' and Cloud's date, steals the keystone, and throws it to one of the Turks in a helicopter. Cait Sith admits that he's been a Shinra spy this whole time. Cloud and Aeris are understandably fuming at this news, but Cait Sith admits that even if they destroy his current body, it won't matter because this isn't his real body, just a robot he's piloting from Midgar. What's even worse, Shinra have Marlene and Aeris' mom held captive, so the protagonists have no choice but to allow Cait Sith to continue to tag along. The sheer low that Cait Sith is willing to go to in this scene makes him, in my opinion, completely irredeemable. He undergoes an implied character arc, but I honestly don't care. Holding innocent bystanders for ransom just puts him beyond the moral event horizon for me. Hell, even Barrett, who actually killed innocent people in the name of the greater good, was still doing it to try and stop a great evil. Cait Sith's actions are being done to protect Shinra's interests, not as any kind of necessary evil. So you'll hopefully understand if I think Cait Sith is scum even after he saves Barrett and Tifa from execution. Hell, even then he isn't saving them because he thinks they're the good guys, but rather just because he doesn't believe in the death penalty. The fact that his body is a robot controlled from a remote location actually gets a payoff in the first dungeon after it gets brought up. We're trying to acquire the black materia in the hopes of keeping it out of Sephiroth's hands. It's found inside the Temple of the Ancients, but there's a catch. Whenever it gets removed from its pedestal, the entire temple will collapse in on itself, crushing anyone inside. Since Cait Sith's body is expendable, this makes him the ideal candidate for such a task. However, in a baffling display of character, as he's bunny hopping over to the black materia in order to take it, he still acts like he's making some huge noble sacrifice, despite the fact that it isn't a sacrifice at all was the whole reason he was chosen for this job. Either Cait Sith's body is replaceable or it fucking isn't, Katase. Make up your damn mind. Even after the temple collapses, Cait Sith appears immediately afterwards with a new body, so literally the only thing that was lost is an inanimate object that Shinra is paying for anyway. As the game progresses, Cait Sith starts to act more like a triple agent, and this is where his implied character arc comes in. Now, most of you probably know what a double agent is. A guy who pretends to have a change of heart so he can infiltrate an enemy faction, but in reality is still entirely loyal to his original faction. Well, a triple agent is somebody who pretends to be a double agent at first, but the problem is that he's having a change of heart for real. He then becomes a double agent for the faction he was originally supposed to be infiltrating. The original faction thinks he's a double agent, but in reality, he's only leaking cherry-picked and heavily doctored intel to the original faction, while simultaneously leaking the full, unabridged intel from the original faction to the new faction. That's what Cait Sith starts to act like. At one point, prior to the quest for the huge materia, Cait Sith offers us the chance to eavesdrop on the Shinra board meeting so we can hear about their plans. This seems like something a triple agent would do. However, the reason I call this an implied character arc rather than an explicit one is because we really don't know if Cait Sith is a triple agent or not. With Severus Snape, it is eventually made absolutely clear that he was a triple agent. But with Cait Sith, he only does something that is kind of like what a triple agent would do. He leaks some Shinra intel to us, but we honestly have no way of knowing exactly how complete this intel is. Perhaps Shinra actually wanted Avalanche to go to all the trouble of collecting the huge materia so they didn't have to. That certainly seems like something Shinra would do. In addition to that, we don't know how much Avalanche intel Cait Sith has leaked to Shinra, cherry-picked or otherwise. So because we don't know all the facts, I do not feel comfortable completely labeling Cait Sith as a triple agent. But more importantly than that, as I stated before, his holding hostage of Marlene and Aeris' mom is just so below the belt that even if Cait Sith really did become a triple agent, I wouldn't care. He can still go fuck himself with a spike. Before we move on to the main event character analysis, let's discuss the only optional character I chose to pick up in my playthrough, Yuffie. We actually acquire her by getting into a random encounter while we're in a forested area. The longer we go without encountering her, the greater the chances are that we'll encounter her. After we defeat her, she's left unconscious and we suddenly find ourselves in an open plain. Which is weird considering that we can only get her in battle if we're in a forested area, so why not just have us be in a forested area after the battle? And can choose to revive her, in what I think is supposed to be a comedy segment, although I didn't find it very funny. There's a conversation where Yuffie assumes we want to fight her again, and then assumes we want her to tag along with us, while the protagonists remain completely indifferent to both. Anyway, she ends up joining our party. Now, do you remember in my Final Fantasy II retrospective when I criticized how Lena, a pirate captain, had suddenly and arbitrarily became a good guy simply because you beat her in a fight? Well, Yuffie's character arc actually acknowledges how contrived this is, and it does so by doing the opposite. Yuffie joins the group, but it's only because she's biding her time. She tried mugging us in the woods head to head, and that didn't work. So instead, she's waiting for the right moment when she can swipe our materia from us without us noticing. This right moment comes when we enter the city of Wutai, Yuffie's hometown. With her in our party, we get mugged by some thugs, and as we fight them off, we suddenly find all our materia is missing. In what I assume is meant to be a comedy routine, we chase Yuffie all around the city of Wutai, and eventually find out that she is trying to steal materia from people in the hopes of rearming the people of Wutai in order to lead a resistance against somebody, Shinra? It's never fully explained who Wutai's enemy is. Anyway, the comedy chase sequence continues and she eventually finds herself kidnapped by returning Don Corneo, somehow disgraced and ruined since we last saw him. Back in Midgar, it was heavily implied that women came to Corneo willingly in the hopes of being chosen by him. But here, there is nothing willing about any of this. He simply kidnaps two women, ties them up, ignores their explicit verbal objections, and then tries to decide which of his kidnapped victims he wants to rape. Oh, and as if that weren't enough, he has the unmitigated gall to try and act like he's the real victim in all of this. Now, of course, we can't let this happen. Yuffie may have stolen our materia, but she doesn't deserve to be raped for it. She deserves to get the shit beaten out of her and have her body mutilated until she gives it back. So, we do the only thing anyone with half a conscience can do in this situation. We save her. She is so grateful for us saving her that she gives us back our stolen materia willingly. It's a fairly bog-standard character arc, but at least there's nothing wrong with it narratively speaking, like Barrett's or Red 13's character arcs. However, the second quest in Wutai is, in my opinion, a much more interesting story. Gameplay-wise, this side quest is nothing to write home about. It's basically Yuffie going to her father's dojo and finding her way up the tower in a series of one-on-one duels. At the end, she faces, and even bests, her father, the master of the dojo. This time around, it isn't Yuffie who undergoes the character arc. There are a few stories out there where the main character was right all along, and it's actually a side character who undergoes the character arc. The most famous example of this type of story is Disney's The Little Mermaid, where it's King Triton, not Ariel, who has the character arc in the end when he gives up his bigotry towards humans. Yuffie's side quest in her father's dojo is such a story. Her father realizes that Yuffie was right all along and that it was wrong for Wutai to capitulate and become a tourist town. Now, at first I thought this was just another example of someone like Alina getting her ass kicked and then suddenly deciding that the one who kicked her ass must be in the right because might and right are apparently one and the same. But the more I think about it, the more I realize that at least in this specific instance, such a main theme actually works. Now, to be perfectly clear, I do not condone the moral that might makes right in 999,999 cases out of a million. I only think it works in this one specific instance. Yuffie's father, Gogo, is a martial arts master, so obviously he holds quite a lot of personal value in the importance of strengthening your body, mind, and spirit. His existing method for doing so has been to coop himself up inside his dojo, completely isolating himself from the outside world so he can pursue his training entirely unhindered by the distractions of modern civilization. Yuffie, by contrast, has been out there actually getting shit done, and because she has bested him in combat, that means she has demonstrated that having a goal to work towards is a more efficient means of getting stronger than cutting yourself off from society so that you can train without distractions. In this case, might really does make right, not because being stronger than somebody else gives you the moral right to impose your will onto them, but because might for its own sake is the very thing Gogo inspires to achieve. So now it's time for the actual main character of this game, Cloud Strife. This is the first Final Fantasy game where one character was chosen to the exclusion of all other characters to simply be the main character. In Final Fantasy V, I mentioned that Bartz was the POV character, but any one of the characters in question could be the character who appears in the overworld. This time around, whenever Cloud is eligible to be in your party, you have to have him in your party. Cloud is either mandatory or not allowed at all. He is never optional. Also, while you can switch up the party's attack formation so that Cloud is in the middle or in the bottom, he is still the character who appears in the overworld, whereas in earlier Final Fantasy games, whichever character was at the top of the party formation was the overworld character. All of that sounds like I'm nitpicking, but it just goes to show how much Katase considered Cloud to be the definitive main character of this game. This is in stark contrast to Final Fantasy VI, where Katase wanted every playable character to be the character that the player could choose as their main character. Cloud starts the game off as a mercenary for hire. He claims to be a former member of a private paramilitary corporation called Soldier. He even has the glowing eyes that all Soldier members have when they're soaked in Mako energy in order to enhance their physical abilities. He starts the game working for Avalanche, not because he supports their cause. He even outright says at one point that he doesn't care about the fate of the planet, even though he still has to live there. But because they're paying him. He gets roped into the main conflict not because he begins to empathize with Avalanche's purpose, but because Aeris hires him to be her bodyguard in exchange for sex. This means that wherever Aeris goes, Cloud is sure to follow. When Aeris gets kidnapped by Shinra, Cloud goes to the Shinra headquarters to rescue her. One thing leads to another, and before we know it, Cloud's and Aeris' goals eventually become one and the same with those of Avalanche. When Aeris is killed, he is technically relieved of his duty to be her bodyguard, but he makes it his mission in life to atone for his failure to protect her and avenge her death. About halfway through the game, the protagonists visit the town of Nibelheim, where Cloud and Tifa were born. Cloud and Tifa both remember that this village was burned to the ground by Sephiroth and Shinra. However, when they return to Nibelheim, they find the city remarkably intact. The townsfolk swear that the city was never destroyed in the first place, and when Cloud enters his mother's home, his mother doesn't even recognize him. What the hell? Suddenly, Cloud's backstory has an air of mystery to it. Later in the game, when we acquire the Black Materia, Sephiroth actually takes control of Cloud and forces Cloud to hand the Black Materia to him. The plot thickens. How can Sephiroth make Cloud do this? Well, after Aeris' death, Sephiroth takes Cloud and Tifa into a simulated reenactment of the destruction of Nibelheim. You know, the destruction that the residents of that city claim never happened. It seems that we're finally going to get some answers for these questions, and Sephiroth certainly gives us a few answers. However, because Sephiroth is, you know, a fucking murdering psychopath, Cloud and Tifa repeatedly remind themselves that they aren't going to believe a word he tells them. However, the more he tells them, the more it starts to make sense. It wasn't Cloud who went to Nibelheim all those years ago, it was some black-haired guy. While Tifa may have grown up with someone named Cloud, this isn't the same guy. The current Cloud is actually a failed prototype clone of the original Sephiroth, implanted with false memories to make himself better pretend to be Cloud. This would certainly explain why Cloud's mother doesn't recognize him. It would also explain why Sephiroth is able to mind control him, but of course Cloud and Tifa refuse to believe him, and to prove him wrong, Cloud remembers everything that happened in his life except for one very important thing. Try as he might, he just can't seem to remember how he joined Soldier. He has the glowing eyes that Soldier members have, but he can't remember the actual act of joining Soldier. His creator must have forgotten to give him that memory. Compounding this problem is the fact that, just before the events of the game, Tifa remembers meeting an unconscious and heavily injured Cloud in Midgar, and Cloud somehow remembers things he shouldn't remember, but doesn't remember things he should, although we're never told exactly what those things are. The evidence honestly starts to look irrefutable. Sephiroth may not be the most reliable of witnesses, but even Hitler would be believed if the evidence he gave you matches up perfectly with what you already know. As such, Cloud begins to believe it and begins to go along with Shinra's grand plan of completing Jenova, completely forgetting the common sense notion that if he's had the free will to defy Shinra's mission up to this point, he's obviously has the free will to defy it now. However, given the identity crisis he's going through at the moment, I don't blame him for not connecting the dots on that. However, after he merges with Jenova, Cloud gets an overdose of Mako energy that should have killed him, but somehow it just sends him into a coma instead. When he and Tifa get dunked into a vat of underground Mako energy, Tifa ends up inside Cloud's mind. Somehow. The logistics of how that works are never explained. With Tifa's help, Cloud uncovers the bits of his past that fully explain his backstory, and quite frankly, I must say it leaves me disappointed. This is indeed the same Cloud that Tifa grew up with. However, Tifa was really popular in her hometown while Cloud, well, wasn't. He had a crush on Tifa and would often watch Tifa and her friends from afar, which I think is meant to explain how Cloud remembers things he shouldn't remember.
He's a peeping Tom.
Anyway, he decided he wanted to join Soldier, not for its own sake, but because he believed if they could whip him into shape, Tifa might actually reciprocate his affections for her. However, he doesn't have any memories of joining Soldier, not because Hojo, his creator, forgot to program in those memories, but because he was rejected for service. He was so ashamed of this failure of his that he actively suppressed and buried the memory. He noticed that a guy named Zack, who did make it into Soldier and who looks an awful lot like Cloud. Zack is actually the one who came to Nibelheim with Sephiroth. Meanwhile, the real Cloud, still determined to keep his promise to Tifa to come to her rescue, but too ashamed to show his face to Tifa after completely and utterly failing to do what he promised to do, he decided to accompany them as a masked, anonymous Shinra soldier, allowing him to have his cake and eat it too in this regard. It's worth mentioning that Zack's name was mentioned in the town of Gungaga when his parents remarked that Cloud looks a lot like Zack, although the differences become apparent when you put the two characters side by side and look at them closely. So, since Zack was now out of the picture and couldn't step in to point out that Cloud was full of shit, Cloud decided to pull a Gilderoy Lockhart on us and pretend like he was Zack. He started taking credit for all of Zack's achievements, became skilled in Zack's trademark weapon of a giant sword, dressed in Zack's clothes, and even taught himself to replicate Zack's victory pose of twirling his sword around in circles, all to try and convince himself, and therefore convince everyone else, that he wasn't the sheer utter failure he actually was. He then took on the job of a freelance merc, which is how we see him at the beginning of the game, simply because it was the only career he could get, and he just acted like he quit Soldier rather than was rejected by him. After Cloud wakes up from his coma, he apologizes to everyone for faking his success. But here's the thing, he didn't actually fake his success at all. Sure, he took credit for some of Zack's achievements in Soldier, but he still became a strong and capable fighter in his own right. He just needed to find the right motivation. At first, his motivation was to just get laid, but then his motivation was to atone for his shameful failure. That second motivation may have been a motivation he was ashamed of, but it worked. He may have pretended to be someone he wasn't while he acquired these skills, but the skills themselves were 100% real. When he cuts through enemies like butter, he isn't faking those kills. He literally can't fake those kills. He may have faked some credentials, but then he still became strong. He became brave, and he even finally got Tifa to fall in love with him, and most importantly of all, he didn't even need Soldier to do it for him. In fact, when you look at it that way, he is actually more of a success than Zack was, because he is not only a success, but a self-made success at that. So, because Cloud is the main character, it should come as no surprise that he also has the deepest and most thought-provoking character arc. However, Cloud's is also the only character arc in the game that I would classify as incomplete. Yes, I said it, Cloud's character arc is interesting, but it is also woefully incomplete, because there are a lot of questions that still remain unanswered. First, Cloud's identity crisis certainly seems to be overriding what Sephiroth had said about Cloud simply being a failed Sephiroth clone experiment. As it turns out, Sephiroth really was full of shit, just like Cloud and Tifa knew all along. The current Cloud is indeed the original Cloud. However, this comes with its own set of problems. See, by retconning the part about Cloud being a Sephiroth clone, that reinstates the questions raised earlier. How is Sephiroth able to mind control Cloud if Cloud isn't a clone? How come Cloud's mom doesn't recognize him? If the memory of Nibelline being burned to the ground is a real memory that Cloud and Tifa actually share, and the only difference is Cloud's point of view during those events, then how come the residents of Nibelline insist it never happened? While we have an explanation, a creepy, pervy explanation, mind you, but an explanation nonetheless, as to how Cloud remembers things he shouldn't remember, we still don't have an explanation as to how Cloud doesn't seem to remember things he should. And last but not least, if Cloud failed to join Soldier, nor is he a clone, then how come he still has the glowing eyes that come with being infused with Mako energy? These are all questions that have answers to them if we accept that Cloud is nothing but a Sephiroth clone. But that explanation is wholly incompatible with Cloud's revised explanation about suppressing memories of his failures. You can't have both explanations at the same time, one has to go. Some backstories are mutually compatible, these two are not. Now, while I was working on this script for this retrospective video, I had a conversation with one of my subscribers in the comments. He stated that he believes that all the loose ends are tied up with Cloud's character arc. but he also stated that he had done all the side quests and done everything the game has to offer. For this reason, I am willing to remain open to the possibility that all of those other questions might have gotten proper explanations in some of the side content. Explanations that are still compatible with Child's memory suppression backstory. That still hold up even after Sephiroth's explanation of "you're not a real boy" is retconned away. That being said, I still maintain that this is a narrative failure on the part of the game director Yoshinori Kitase. Why? Because if you're going to make something in a game into an optional side quest, then the main quest needs to be written on the assumption that the player didn't do the side content. It's called Chekhov's gun, a rule of writing that states that everything in a story, no matter how big or small, needs to have a payoff of some kind. In the case of video game side quests, if the payoff for something is going to be in an optional side quest, then the thing to be paid off should be just as optional as the payoff itself. Take, for example, Yuffie's side quest over in Wutai. Both of these side quests are designed to give Yuffie and her father some character development, but they are also optional. Without these side quests, Yuffie is just a blank slate. However, Yuffie herself is also an optional character, so it fits. I did what I consider to be a reasonable amount of side quests in this game. I certainly did a side quest if the game itself told me that such a side quest was doable. However, the game never directed me to any side activities that looked like they might have fleshed out Cloud's backstory. I mean, I didn't do all of the mini-games available at the Gold Saucer, but I don't think I would have gotten an explanation for Cloud's mom not recognizing him from any of them. If the game had actually done a little more to notify me that some side content was available, I might have done the side content. To show you what I mean, let's take a look at my childhood game, which I have referenced on and off for half of my Final Fantasy retrospective videos. Super Mario RPG: Legend of the Seven Stars. After you defeat Bowyer, the next place you've unlocked is a place called Pipe Vault. However, you also have the option of heading straight to the section of the game after that, Moleville. This communicates to the player that Pipe Vault, and by proxy Yoshi's Island, are optional side content in this game. However, while going through Pipe Vault is optional, it is still mandatory that you go past Pipe Vault in the world map, and therefore receive the notification that the optional content is there if you want it. This is how to best introduce side quests to the player. Make it optional to do, but very, very difficult to miss. This is especially true if the side quests contain essential character development for the game's main character. But, as it stands, Cloud has the deepest and most thought-provoking character arc in the entire game, but his character arc is also woefully incomplete. The game starts out with the main enemy being Shinra. The main plot appears to be that Shinra is destroying the Earth by extracting its Mako energy to power its own technology, and the planet needs this Mako energy in order to survive. Some eco-terrorists who call themselves Avalanche have made it their mission in life to destroy every Mako reactor by any means necessary. The game takes place in a dystopian corporatocracy. That is to say, there is no separation of corporation and state. There has never been a corporatocracy in real life because to be a corporatocracy, it is not enough that big corporations simply have a lot of sway and lobbying power with elected officials. To be a corporatocracy, the corporation must literally be the state. There must literally be no distinction between the corporation and the government whatsoever. The city of Midgar technically has a mayor, but he is a mayor in name only. He is entirely under the employ of Shinra. He performs only purely ministerial duties, and his office is literally just a cubicle on some random floor in the Shinra headquarters. So the Shinra Board of Directors are the real government. However, just as Avalanche is infiltrating Shinra headquarters in the hopes of dealing a lethal blow to Shinra, they find that a devastating blow has already been dealt for them, at the hands of Sephiroth, the real main villain of this game. Sephiroth's ability to plow through the entire Shinra security force single-handedly does a good job of establishing Sephiroth as a formidable adversary. Later, we get Cloud's backstory, or at least the revised version of his backstory before his aforementioned true backstory was revealed, where he explains that Sephiroth had found out that he wasn't born, but made by Shinra in an experiment to create the perfect fighting machine. His mother, Genova, was not a woman, but the name of the project that was used to create him. Driven mad by the betrayal that he isn't a real boy, he swore to annihilate all of humanity. We then embark on a rather annoying game of cat and mouse as we try to catch Sephiroth and stop him, but he is always one step ahead of us, leaving a trail of dead bodies in his wake. Honestly, this section of the game just feels like sheer padding. The fact that he was able to take out all of Shinra's security forces already shows him to be a powerful warrior. If we had taken out most of these innocent deaths, it probably would have caused Aeris' death to carry a lot more weight. As I mentioned earlier, the sheer evil of Sephiroth's actions in this supposedly iconic scene are heavily watered down because we've already seen evidence of him killing hundreds of people at one time. Removing this pointless game of cat and mouse would have greatly improved the impact of that scene, but also would have greatly improved the game's pacing. Like Final Fantasy II, I believe this game suffers from terrible pacing and for many of the same reasons. So, after an indeterminate amount of time playing cat and mouse, the game finally reveals to us that Sephiroth is headed to a place called the Temple of the Ancients. So we go there in order to stop him from doing whatever the fuck he is planning. When we reach the end of the temple, we find that it stores the black materia. Sephiroth states that he intends to become one with the planet, and the heroes finally start to piece together what Sephiroth's actual goal is. Whenever the planet is wounded, Lifestream flows to the source of the wound in order to repair it, like white and red blood cells in the human body. So Sephiroth plans to use the black materia in order to summon a meteor called, Meteor, to cause as much damage to the planet at one time as he possibly can. Okay, side note, but half of these names in this game completely suck. A paramilitary company called Soldier, a meteor called Meteor. Later in the game, we'll eventually get a weapon of mass destruction called Weapon, and a village made out of skeletal remains called Bone Village. Seriously, Katase, you got really lazy with these names. Anyway, when Meteor, oh god that is such a stupid name, strikes the planet, that will inflict maximum damage onto the planet, causing a maximum amount of Lifestream, the unrefined source of Mako energy, to gravitate to the point of impact. Sephiroth plans to be at the center of the Earth and absorb all of that Lifestream for himself, turning him into a super god. Obviously, we can't let that happen, and so the easiest way to prevent him from doing that is to take the black materia for ourselves and destroy it the first chance we get. Yeah, pity we don't do that! Instead, our goal is to take the black materia for ourselves and hold on to it to keep it out of Sephiroth's hands. Why? Okay, the first time we get the materia, it is immediately taken from us thanks to Sephiroth's ability to control Cloud. But then we get the materia back, and then we have plenty of opportunity to destroy it, but we don't. Instead, Cloud is advised to give the black materia to someone else, just in case he's mind-controlled again. No, dude, just destroy the shitting thing. No need to keep it away from Sephiroth if we just destroy it. Can materia even be destroyed? I don't recall seeing even so much as a throwaway line of world building in this game suggesting that materia is indestructible. In fact, there's even a leg of the main quest that heavily implies that materia can be destroyed. Specifically, I'm talking about the huge materia subplot. Basically, as Meteor is approaching Earth and everyone is panicking, thinking the end of the world is near, Shinra plans to use an ICBM to blow Meteor up, leading to the culmination of Cid's character arc, as I mentioned earlier. However, they plan to use some huge materia to power the bomb. Clearly, they were expecting the huge materia to be destroyed since, you know, that's kind of the whole point of making a bomb out of it. Now sure, we extract the huge materia from the ship before we evacuate through the escape pod, so the huge materia doesn't actually get destroyed, but the game definitely makes a huge implication that destroying materia is totally possible. So anyway, speaking of that huge materia subplot, it's one that I really don't like. It's basically a multi-tiered fetch quest, where we endeavor to get the huge materia for ourselves before Shinra gets it. Honestly, why do we even need to do that? Why not let Shinra just use their bomb to blow Meteor up? They're obviously planning on using it for a noble purpose. They literally won't be able to use the huge materia for a corrupt purpose afterwards, since the materia is going to get blown up. And it's not like Avalanche doesn't want Shinra to succeed in destroying Meteor, since when Meteor starts pulling itself together again, the good guys are clearly disappointed that it didn't work. So why are you racing to acquire the huge materia for yourself then? Speaking of the bomb not working, that's another gripe I have with this subplot. See, when we hijack Cid's rocket, that rocket is carrying a huge materia bomb. We take the huge materia out, effectively defusing the bomb, and evacuate the rocket. The rocket then crashes into Meteor, sands the huge materia, and the Meteor just pulls itself together. Meanwhile, everyone is disappointed that Shinra's plan didn't work. Well, no shit, you defused the fucking bomb. What the hell did you expect would happen? Might the plan have worked if you hadn't sabotaged the plan by defusing the bomb? Or was the huge materia never even necessary in the first place? If it wasn't even necessary for the bomb to go off, then what was it even doing on the spaceship in the first place? And that leads me to my biggest gripe with this entire subplot. When we take the huge materia to Red 13's grandpa, Bugenhagen, we can then use it to obtain some equipable materia that gives us some of the most powerful spells in the game. However, that's literally the only thing the huge materia is used for. Some powerful but otherwise totally optional spells. The huge materia subplot amounts to nothing as far as the story is concerned, and it also amounts to very little as far as actual gameplay is concerned. So, if the huge materia itself isn't mandatory to complete the game, don't you think the quest to obtain it would work better as an optional side quest? Remember earlier I said this game's story has a pacing problem similar to that in Final Fantasy II? Well, this is it. In that game, you go on a long, annoying quest to obtain the Ultima spell, and when you finally get it, you never have to actually use the Ultima spell at any point in order to complete the game. Recall, in that video, I opined that if the Ultima spell itself was going to be optional, the quest to obtain it should likewise be optional. I also opined that because the quest for Ultima was mandatory to complete the game, whereas the prize for doing this quest line was not, that caused the story for that game to suffer from bad pacing. Well, this game has the exact same problem with the huge materia. If the materia itself isn't necessary to complete the game, either in story or in gameplay, the quest to obtain it should be just as optional as the materia itself. So, as we take the huge materia to Bugenhagen, He then accompanies us to Forgotten City. Fetch quest, fetch quest, fetch quest, and we find out that the only way we can stop Meteor is with a spell called Holy, which can only be brought to Earth via prayer. We also find out that Aeris had prayed for Holy immediately before she died, and the white materia she was carrying with her at the time was glowing green, meaning Holy had accepted her prayer and agreed to come. So while she did end up getting herself recklessly killed for no reason, at least she accomplished what she set out to do. Still, it would have been nice if she had asked her friends to accompany her to protect her though. So, yay, Holy is coming to save us, we can rest easy, right? Well, no, not really. It's been well over a week since that happened, and Holy should be here by now. So the heroes put 2 and 2 together that Sephiroth is using his magic to block Holy from coming, meaning the only way to stop Meteor is to defeat Sephiroth. Which is precisely what we were going to do anyway, so this divergence just to figure this out was a complete waste of time. So, after a quick divergence where we finally close the Shinra subplot by defeating Shinra, or at least the characters act like they've destroyed Shinra, but I don't recall them doing anything to stop anyone except Hojo, we finally decide to go and finish off Sephiroth. We journey to the center of the Earth where it is surprisingly cool enough that it doesn't kill us instantly from heat. We fight Sephiroth, we defeat Sephiroth, and then something weird happens. Cloud gets sucked into this weird wormhole and then finds himself in a black void. Sephiroth's old body is there to greet us without a shirt on, and so Cloud has to face Sephiroth in a one-on-one duel where he defeats Sephiroth in one hit. What? Huh? The fuck? Is this meant to be symbolic of something? Is this supposed to just be Cloud getting revenge on Sephiroth for killing Aeris? Because, defeating Sephiroth in the preceding fight would have accomplished that narrative purpose just fine. Is this supposed to mean Cloud is casting out the part of him that's a clone of Sephiroth and therefore becoming his own person? Because I thought that was established as being nothing more than Sephiroth spreading bullshit to try and sow discord among the group. I don't mind things in a story being left open to interpretation, but I do expect the story to give me something to interpret. The best stories are those that tell a solid story on their own and invite the audience to fill in the blanks on their own. This set piece is literally all blanks. I can take nothing from this sequence because it gives me nothing.
I mean, if I was just to go banana and told you that was open to interpretation, why wouldn't I be praised?
So then we finally get to the ending, and oh boy does this disappoint. It turns out that Meteor is already so close to hitting the surface that, even though Holy is now working to stop Meteor, it's actually having the opposite effect and is only causing more collateral damage. We notice some live streams that's also gravitating to the Meteor-Holy battle, and then fade to black and cut to end credits. The ending to this game provides no closure whatsoever. We don't even know if the heroes will be able to enjoy the peace they worked so hard for. Oh sure, after the end credits there's an epilogue where 3 people of Red 13's race run up to the top of some mountain and see the remains of Midgar off in the distance. But that epilogue is set 500 years after the events of Final Fantasy VII, so it doesn't provide any real closure to the story other than assuring us that not all life on Earth was wiped out. Narratively speaking, this just leaves me completely unsatisfied. I don't need a dopey-eyed happy ending, but I still would like some closure to the story. George Orwell's 1984 didn't have a happy ending, but at least the ending brought closure to Winston Smith's personal journey. The Twilight Zone, Season 1, Episode 11, and When the Sky Was Opened didn't have a happy ending for the 3 pilots, Forbes, Gart, and Harrington, and it even left quite a few questions unanswered. But at least the story of those 3 pilots were definitively capped. The ending to Final Fantasy VII just feels like a cop-out on Katase's part. However, while the story may suffer from pacing and structural issues, I do appreciate Katase's attempt to explore several central themes. One thing that is brought up on numerous occasions is a place known as the Promised Land. This is a concept that is ripped almost verbatim from the Judeo-Christian faiths, but Katase puts his own spin on the idea. It is said to be a place of great and boundless happiness, although what exactly that entails differs depending on the characters. The Shinra executives believe the Promised Land is full of Mako energy, because it's supposed to be a place of happiness, and selling Mako energy is what makes them happy. So clearly the Promised Land is full of Mako. Cloud has doubts as to whether the Promised Land is even a real thing, while Aeris says that they're supposed to just know when you found the Promised Land. My personal theory on this whole thing is that there is no single definitive Promised Land in this universe. Rather, because it is meant to provide boundless happiness, and because the definition of happiness is almost entirely subjective and internal, the Promised Land is actually a place where each individual person considers to be their personal Promised Land. You're supposed to just know that you've found this place because you experience such overwhelming joy being there that it must be the Promised Land, but it's only your joy. Just like in Final Fantasy V, this game tries its hand at an environmentalist message, only this time around it's much more explicit. In Final Fantasy V, the crystals were the source of energy for the world. This provided a nice analog to the various fuel supplies and other natural resources in the real world, while still keeping it definitively fantastical. Final Fantasy VII also uses a fantastical energy source, Mako energy, and the consumption of this energy is also tearing the planet apart. However, in my humble opinion, it doesn't pack quite the same amount of punch as Final Fantasy V's environmentalist message. For starters, the message of corporate greed is far more explicit in this game than it was in Final Fantasy V. In 5, the king who looked after the water crystal was worried that shutting the crystal down would threaten their way of life. While that could be viewed as greedy, the idea that it would threaten the people's way of life is certainly a lot more sympathetic, or at least a lot closer to being sympathetic, than the Shinra Board of Directors' decision to raise the rates for Mako energy for no other reason than because they can. Second, Barrett's hometown used to operate a coal mine before they sold their land to Shinra to set up a Mako reactor. The implication here is that the coal would have been less destructive to the planet than the Mako reactor. The problem here is that coal is something we actually use in real life as an energy source, and our constant digging for coal is one of the things I mentioned in my Final Fantasy V retrospective video that the crystals in that game were analogous to. So essentially, this game's message is fantastical life energy made out of people's souls is a worse source of energy than the energy source we're already using to destroy our own planet in real life. Well, we kind of already knew that. We don't currently have the technology to use people's souls as an energy source in real life, but if the technology to do so was ever invented, would anyone in their right mind actually dispute that it was totally evil for them to use it for that purpose? What exactly is the message here? Don't fuck with people's souls. No shit, Sherlock. The game also uses Cloud to explore the main themes of personal identity and memory, but I've already said all I can about that character arc, so I won't bother repeating myself here. Last but not least, there is a centralized theme of family, both biological and adoptive. Specifically, this game likes to explore what duties, responsibilities, and loyalties you owe to your family, and whether familial responsibilities should override the greater good or vice versa. Barrett has an enormous sense of paternal duty to Marlene, despite Marlene only being an adoptive daughter to him. Even though she isn't his own flesh and blood, he still feels an enormous duty to protect her with his life. Red 13 feels that family should look after and protect each other, and so he resents his father for shirking this duty. When Cloud is convinced that he is actually a prototype Sephiroth clone, he becomes loyal to Hojo and the Genuva reunion, believing that his duty to his family, Hojo, overrides his duty to protect the Earth. The fact that this game attempts to explore several main themes at one time instead of just having an environmentalist message and having that be the only main theme is certainly ambitious on Katase's part. However, just like with his attempt to ensure as many main characters as possible have character development, his attempt to juggle so many at one time results in quite a few narrative fumbles. In the gameplay department, this game is a huge step up from the previous games. The side quests and minigames may be hit or miss, but the mere fact that this game even has side quests and minigames at all necessarily means it is an improvement over the previous games. Of course, some of these side quests are going to be stinkers, but as the old saying goes, it's better to strike out than to never even step up to the plate at all. Unfortunately, the most important part of an RPG is its story, and this game suffers from several problems with the story's pacing, structure, and execution of its main themes. The most prevalent main theme in this game is a near total retread of Final Fantasy V's main theme, only that game executed the main theme without any real narrative pitfalls to it. There are character arcs aplenty in this game, but almost all of them have significant problems with their execution, just like the rest of the story. Aeris' death is supposed to be one of the most iconic moments in all of gaming, but I personally believe Galif's death in Final Fantasy V carries so much more weight. For all of these reasons, I have decided to rank Final Fantasy VII in between Final Fantasy II and Final Fantasy V. 7 has many of the same narrative pacing and structural problems that 2 has, but it has vastly improved gameplay. So 7 wins out over 2 for the same reasons 6 wins out over 3. Next time, I'll review the game that Square almost forgot about for a time, and actually lost the source code for, preventing it from being given an HD remaster for several years, Final Fantasy VIII. However, I won't be reviewing the original PS1 version of this game. Instead, I'll be reviewing the HD remaster that is currently available on Steam for the PC. Well, ladies and gentlemen, if you enjoyed this retrospective, please hit that subscribe button for more videos just like it. Also, if you enjoyed my content overall, please consider supporting the channel directly, either with Patreon support or channel memberships. Silver and Gold level members and Patreon supporters are allowed to submit requests for video topics, and Gold members and Patreon supporters are allowed to directly assign me video topics that I am guaranteed to cover. In the meantime, however, I am Acer Thorn, and I will see you guys later. Peace!